In a chilling throwback to America's most infamous serial killers, Glen Edward Rogers, known to many as the Casanova Killer, met his end on May 15, 2025. At exactly 6:16 in the evening, Rogers was executed by lethal injection inside a Florida prison, finally paying the price for a string of savage murders that stretched across multiple states.
So-called Casanova Killer. He is less than an hour away from paying the ultimate price. His name is Glen Rogers. Many of you may remember his name if you've been here a long time. He's been on death row since 1997 for the murder of 34-year-old Tina Marie Cribbs at a Tampa motel.
His case, riddled with bizarre confessions and nationwide manhunts, stunned investigators and drew widespread media attention in the mid-90s. From Florida to California, Rogers left behind a trail of women he charmed, deceived, and ultimately killed. Now that he's finally dead, the world is left wondering what were his last words, his final meal, and the final moments before the curtain closed on one of the most disturbing chapters in modern true crime history. Glen Edward Rogers, State of Crime, Florida. Execution date, May 15th, 2025. Glen Edward Rogers, born on July 15, 1962 in Hamilton, Ohio, would later gain notoriety as one of the most unsettling serial killers in modern American history. Dubbed the cross-country killer and the Casanova Killer, Rogers left behind a chilling legacy of violence that spanned several states. His crimes were not limited to murder. They included armed robbery, grand theft auto, and arson. The nickname Casanova Killer stemmed from his ability to charm his victims, often women, before brutally ending their lives. The nickname Cross-Country Killer reflected the widespread geography of his crimes, with investigators tracing his deadly path from California to Florida, with stops in states like Mississippi and Louisiana. His victims, often red-haired women in their 30s, were typically found strangled, stabbed, or burned, highlighting the brutality and pattern of his attacks. In 1995, Rogers launched a violent spree that began in California and stretched across the country, triggering a nationwide manhunt. The string of murders finally caught the attention of the FBI, which added him to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. His addition to the list signaled the urgency and severity of his threat to public safety. Despite early denials and attempts to deflect responsibility, evidence ranging from fingerprints to stolen vehicles which firmly linked him to several of the crimes. He was eventually apprehended in Kentucky after a dramatic police chase that ended with him being forced off the road. His capture marked the end of a chaotic and horrifying chapter of American criminal history, though his name continued to resurface in both courtrooms and media headlines. Rogers's early life was turbulent. Raised in a troubled household in Hamilton as one of 7 siblings, he was expelled from junior high before turning 16. His young girlfriend, Deborah Ann Nix, became pregnant at 14, prompting a teenage marriage. The couple had a second child in 1981, but the relationship quickly deteriorated. In 1983, Nix filed for divorce, alleging that Rogers physically abused her. His violent behavior didn't end there. Over time, Rogers became a transient figure, surfacing across various states while allegedly committing violent crimes. Authorities first became seriously interested in Rogers after the 1994 discovery of 71-year-old Mark Peters's body in a cabin owned by Rogers's family. Peters, a retired electrician who had taken Rogers in, disappeared along with his car and valuables. His remains were later discovered in Beattyville, Kentucky, bound to a chair. Police were led to the location by Rogers's own brother, Clay. This marked the beginning of a broader investigation, linking Rogers to a string of violent and fatal incidents across the country. Rogers's first confirmed murder victim was 33-year-old Sandra Gallagher, a mother of 3 who lived in California. On the night of September 28, 1995, she was seen socializing with Rogers at McRed's Bar in Van Nuys, a neighborhood in Los Angeles. Witnesses recalled seeing the two drinking and leaving the bar together. The next morning, Gallagher's body was discovered in her charred pickup truck, which had been torched and abandoned near Rogers's Van Nuys apartment. An autopsy later revealed that Gallagher had been strangled before her body was burned, suggesting that the fire was intended to destroy evidence of the crime. Rogers' swift disappearance from California following the murder raised red flags for authorities, and within days, he was linked to the brutal act. Following Gallagher's murder, Rogers embarked on a violent journey through the southern United States, leaving a trail of victims in his wake. In each state he passed through Mississippi, Florida, and Louisiana, he became the prime suspect in the murders of women who bore striking similarities to Gallagher. Most were in their 30s with red or reddish hair and lived alone or in vulnerable circumstances. These patterns suggested Rogers was targeting women who fit a specific profile, possibly feeding off a combination of attraction and rage. Law enforcement noted the eerie consistency in the method of killing: strangulation, stabbing, or blunt force trauma, often followed by attempts to conceal the crime through arson or abandonment. The Gallagher case proved to be the start of what law enforcement would later describe as a calculated, methodical spree fueled by charm, manipulation, and explosive violence. Rogers appeared to use his charisma to gain the trust of his victims before turning deadly. His ability to evade capture in multiple states for weeks made him even more dangerous. Authorities believe the murder of Sandra Gallagher was not a moment of impulse, but a deliberate act that set the tone for the string of homicides that followed. That killing not only began his infamous cross-country murder spree, but also cemented his reputation as a cold, calculated predator who could blend in with ease until the bloodshed caught up with him. In the fall of 1995, Glen Rogers met 34-year-old Linda Price at a beer tent during the Mississippi State Fair in Jackson. Described by her sister Kathy Carroll as smitten with Rogers' appearance, Price frequently remarked, "Ain't he good looking?" Their brief relationship escalated quickly, and Rogers soon moved into her apartment. Price, a single mother of 2 teenage children, had been looking forward to Halloween festivities and had plans to host her sister's grandchildren for trick or treating. However, when Carol showed up on Halloween, she was met with an eerie silence. There was no answer at the door, and Rogers had vanished. Price's lifeless body was discovered in her bathtub, a haunting scene eerily similar to the one that would be found days later in Florida. Just a few days after Price's murder, Rogers turned up in Florida, where he encountered 37-year-old Tina Marie Cribbs at the Showtown Bar in Gibsonton. Rogers charmed Cribbs and offered to buy drinks for her and her friends. He later convinced her to give him a ride and eventually lured her to his room at the Tampa 8 Inn. Cribbs was never seen alive again. 2 days later, her body was discovered by a member of the motel's cleaning staff, left in the bathtub, partially clothed, with stab wounds to her chest and buttocks. Rogers had already fled, and a motel clerk reported that he had been driving a white Ford Festiva and had asked that his room not be cleaned, a request that now seemed ominously deliberate. Cribbs's wallet was later found at a rest area in North Florida, and fingerprints at the scene matched Rogers. These 2 cases, Linda Price and Tina Marie Cribbs, highlight a disturbing pattern that defined Rogers's spree. He gained the trust of women with his charm, and then exploited that trust to murder them in brutal, calculated fashion. The recurring detail of victims being left in bathtubs, along with the rapid sequence of murders across multiple states, highlighted both his mobility and methodical nature. Investigators began connecting the dots, and realized they were dealing with a transient killer who left destruction in his wake, with each state only discovering the depth of his violence after he had already moved on. In Bossier City, Louisiana, Glen Rogers was tied to yet another chilling murder, that of 37-year-old Andy Giles Sutton. Sutton had been romantically involved with Rogers for a brief time before her violent end. Her body was found in her apartment, displaying signs of a vicious struggle and a method of death, consistent with Rogers's other known victims. Like the others, Sutton was a red-haired woman in her 30s, reinforcing the emerging pattern in his victim selection. Authorities noted the striking similarities among the victims, not only in appearance but in the brutal and often personal nature of their murders, involving stabbing, strangulation, and being left in secluded or symbolic locations such as bathtubs. As the pattern became clear and the pressure on law enforcement mounted, Rogers's ability to elude capture seemed almost cinematic. But on November 13, 1995, his run came to an end. In Waco, Kentucky, Rogers was spotted driving a white Ford Festiva, the same vehicle stolen from Tina Marie Cribbs. When police attempted to stop him, he fled, initiating a high-speed 13-mile car chase across Madison County. The pursuit reached dangerous speeds, weaving through traffic until authorities managed to corner and arrest him. The dramatic takedown was broadcast live by local news helicopters, turning Rogers into a household name and further fueling the national media storm already surrounding the case. Rogers's arrest marked the culmination of a frenzied manhunt, spanning multiple states, and it ended a killing spree that left a trail of grief and horror across the U.S. The stolen vehicle, the fingerprint evidence, and eyewitness accounts tied him to multiple homicides, and he was soon charged in several jurisdictions. Despite his capture, questions lingered about how many victims Rogers may have claimed in his cross-country rampage. With several unsolved cases fitting his known modus operandi, investigators across the country began reviewing cold cases involving red-haired women murdered in similar fashion. Glen Rogers was first convicted and sentenced to death in 1997 in the state of Florida for the brutal murder of Tina Marie Cribbs. The evidence against him was overwhelming: surveillance footage, the stolen vehicle, and eyewitness testimonies firmly placed him at the scene. 2 years later, in 1999, the state of California also secured a conviction and issued a separate death sentence for the earlier murder of Sandra Gallagher. These convictions cemented Rogers's status as a violent serial killer and ensured he would spend the remainder of his life under the shadow of capital punishment. Since his incarceration, Rogers has remained on death row, primarily at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. Over the years, his legal team has pursued a series of appeals aimed at overturning or delaying his executions. Among the key arguments raised were claims of severe childhood trauma, including abuse, which they argued influenced his violent behavior. Additionally, the defense challenged Florida's use of certain lethal injection drugs, claiming they could cause excessive pain and therefore constitute cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. Despite these efforts, all of Rogers's appeals have been consistently denied. In May 2025, the Florida Supreme Court issued a final rejection of his latest motion, clearing the way for the state to proceed with the execution. With time running out, Rogers's attorneys have now turned to the U.S. Supreme Court in a last-ditch effort to obtain a stay. Unless the nation's highest court intervenes, Glen Rogers is scheduled to be executed by lethal injection on May 15, 2025, bringing an end to one of the most chilling criminal sagas of the 1990s. Rogers became the subject of widespread media attention due to his alleged confession to the 1994 murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. His brother Clay Rogers claimed Glen had confessed to him and a 2012 documentary, My Brother the Serial Killer, reignited debate about his role in the infamous case. According to Rogers, O.J. Simpson hired him to break into Nicole's house and possibly kill her. He allegedly admitted to a criminal profiler that Simpson had instructed, "You may have to kill the bee." Despite these sensational claims, the LAPD firmly stated that they had no evidence linking Rogers to the Goldman-Simpson murders and remained confident in Simpson's guilt. And now, the moment everyone's been waiting for, Glen Edward Rogers' final hours, his last meal, and his chilling parting words. At a press conference held at 3:30 in the afternoon, just hours before the execution, officials from the Department of Corrections revealed that Rogers had awakened at exactly 3:45 in the morning. For his final meal, he chose a simple but telling comfort combo: pizza, chocolate, and soda, a final taste of freedom before facing justice. He had only one visitor that day, his wife. According to the Tampa Bay Times, Rogers' brother made the trip from Kentucky to see him one last time the day before the execution. He returned home shortly after. USA Today reported that the families of the victims supported the execution, and yes, they were present. The people whose lives were shattered by his crimes stood witness as justice was finally served. Rogers was pronounced dead at 6:16 in the evening, and his last words, according to reporter Dan Sullivan with the Tampa Bay Times, Rogers used his final breath not to confess, but to speak to the people he left behind: his wife, his brothers, his sons, his grandchildren, and his friends. Then, turning his words toward the victims' families, he said, "I know there's a lot of questions that you need answers to. I promise you, in the near future, the questions will be answered, and I hope in some way will bring you closure. President Trump, keep making America great. I'm ready to go." With those final words, the Casanova killer's story came to a dramatic end, but the questions, the pain, and the scars he left behind may never fully disappear. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories from the darkest corners of the criminal world.